Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, colleagues, friends, a warm welcome to the Maison de la Paix. My name is Gilles Carbonnier. I'm a professor of international economics, and I serve as the director of studies here at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And tonight we have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Joseph Nye for a lecture on, I think, what is one of the most critical questions of our times. What is the future of the American liberal order, and are we seeing the end of it? We are particularly honored to welcoming you, Professor Nye, at the Graduate Institute for many reasons, but I will just mention three of them. First, Professor Nye is and ranks among the most renowned and influential scholar in our field of international relations. Professor Nye has been, if I'm not mistaken, a faculty member of Harvard University since 1964. And he is currently University Distinguished Professor of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a school which he directed as dean between 1995 and 2004. For many students taking classes in international relations, international governance, Joseph Nye's seminal book, Power and Interdependence, co-authored with Bob Cohen and first released in 1977, still is a key reference and a textbook. And as a matter of fact, we were just together in the library, and it was difficult to have Mr. Nye coming up to this room because he was stopped by students wanting to have an autograph. So this is also a testimony of the fact that beyond your books, which we have in the library, you're extremely welcome here. One actually cannot understate the importance of Professor Nye's contribution to security studies, to transnational governance, to strategy, and of course, his contribution of advancing the notions of soft power and smart power. Second reason, Professor Nye has had a remarkable career in the policy world. He has served as Deputy Undersecretary of State in the Carter administration. He was chairman of the National Intelligence Council and subsequently Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration, among many others. Third, I wish to stress that Joseph Nye is a longtime friend of the Graduate Institute. Indeed, he spent a year here in Geneva as invited professor of the Graduate Institute by the end of the 1960s. And I think that we have the chance to have with us a few friends from these good old days in the audience. So you are most welcome. Professor Nye, on behalf of Philippe Burin, the director of the Graduate Institute, I thank you very much for having accepted our invitation, and we very much look forward to listening to your lecture. So you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I must say it is a real pleasure for me to be back in Geneva. My wife Molly and I had a wonderful time here at the Graduate Institute, but my, what a difference. It has certainly grown and prospered, obviously in this spectacular building, but also in its reputation and its contribution to a very important field. So it's truly a pleasure to be back. Now, I'd like to tell you that I could answer the question that is up on the screen behind me. If you came thinking you were going to get the answer, it might be false pretenses. But rather than keep you in suspense, I think what I'll do is tell you how I would bet, because nobody knows the answer to that question. If I were to make a bet, I would bet that the answer to that question is no, but I wouldn't bet the mortgage of my house on it. So that's a preview of how I will try to analyze the extremely important question that we're facing. Now, in one sense, it's an easy question to answer. Everything comes to an end. So obviously, an American order that we've seen since 1945 is going to come to an end. The key question, of course, is when. There's a wonderful story about a British statesman of the 18th century, Horace Walpole, who, when the American colonies became independent, lamented, he said, "Woe is Britain, we are now reduced to a miserable little island like Sardinia." I hope there are no Sardinians here, but in any case, this was on the eve of Britain starting its most important century, which was fueled by the Industrial Revolution. So I say that merely to remind us that we need to be humble about predictions, about what we think is going to happen. When we talk about human beings as organisms, we can get a fairly clear sense of a trajectory and what it means to decline or come to an end and so forth. I can assure you, without any fear of contradiction, that given the dates you just heard in the introduction, I am in decline. But I can't assure you about a country being in decline or an order being in decline. And that's why it's worth going through the exercise that I intend to try to structure for you, which is not so much to answer this question as to help you how to think about it, to get a more intelligent judgment or to make your own bets. Now, first of all, let's start with a baseline which is accurate. And very often people say that, we're in extraordinary disorderly times today. We've never seen anything like this. Well, in fact, that's not true. As Henry Kissinger points out in his recent book on world order, there's never been a truly global world order. And people who go back and say, but weren't we living in an age of American hegemony for the last 75 years? The answer is no, not really. At best, it was half hegemony. If you ask about the international order that the Americans helped to structure after 1945, it did not include China, did not include India, did not include the Soviet Union. There's more than half of the world right there. So it was a set of like-minded countries which were obeying a set of rules and structuring a set of alliances, but this view that the world order was an American hegemony is again a bit fictitious. And unless we have a clear baseline, it's going to be pretty hard to get an idea of how we judge where we are today. But I think you can raise a question, a legitimate question, which is whatever you call the last 70 years or so, are we at an inflection point? Are we at a turning point in which we're seeing something which will look 10 years from now as a major beginning of a decline or a major point in history in which we'll say, aha, that was it? For example, my colleague Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, distinguished economist, had a piece in the Financial Times last week in which he said the big question that arose after Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement was whether this was an inflection point in history or whether it was a temporary aberration. And Larry is not alone on this. If you look at the writings of such distinguished columnists and observers as Martin Wolf or Philip Stevens, then you'll see very similar opinions expressed. Now, how do we go about thinking about this? How do we structure our thought to try to answer this question other than hunches and guesses? If you look at international relations theory, there's a theory called power transition theory, which is about what happens when one country rises, another declines, what are we to expect? And power transition theory is often associated with Thucydides and his famous explanation of the causes of the Peloponnesian War, in which the Greek city-state system tore itself apart, in which he said it was caused at base by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. And many people say that's the story of our world today, just as the last century world was World War I, which was caused by the rise of the power of Germany and the fear that created in Britain, and the fact that the European state system tore itself apart and Europe ceased to be the center of the global balance of power. What we're going to see in the 21st century on this analogy or this view of power transition theory is the rise in the power of China is going to cause fear in the United States, which is going to lead to some great conflict or conflagration, perhaps growing out of a minor incident. After all, the Peloponnesian War started with an episode at Epidamnus, which was of no great significance, but in that climate of power transition and fear, it led to escalation, which was of tremendous importance. If that view of power transition theory is correct, what I call the Thucydidean view, we're in for a very bad century, because a major war between the United States and China, which was once analyzed by the Rand Corporation as a war that the United States would win, but at enormous cost to both sides, that would be bad for the US, bad for China, and bad for the rest of the world. So that's one view of power transition theory, and a lot of people are writing about that and paying a lot of attention to it. The trouble that I have is that many people think only of that aspect of power transition, which you might call the problem of the rising power doing too much, and thereby frightening the established power. I have argued that there's another aspect of power transition, which is almost the opposite. It's that the rising power doesn't do enough. And to try to get people to focus on that rather than merely the age-old Thucydides problem, I've called that the Kindleberger trap instead of the Thucydides trap. Now, who is Kindleberger? Charlie Kindleberger was a very distinguished economist at MIT who was a student of the Great Depression and of the 1930s. And Kindleberger argued that the problem of the 1930s, the reason that it turned out so badly, the reason the Great Depression was so deep and devastating, was because the United States had become the most powerful country in the world, but didn't act like it. It was still a free rider. And Britain, which had produced global public goods in the 19th century, had been so severely weakened by World War I that it could no longer do the job. And the failure of the Americans to live up to their new position is the reason that you got in the 1930s what the great poet W.H. Auden called a low, miserable decade, a decade marked by a deep depression, by genocide, and by World War II. Now, to understand that, you have to go back to the question of what is an order and what are global public goods. A public good is something from which we all can benefit and none can be excluded. The simple example of this in terms of domestic politics is clean air. If we have clean air, it's going to benefit me, but I can't keep it from benefiting you. And that's a public good. And in a well-ordered domestic polity, we rely on governments to provide public goods because people don't do enough to tax themselves on this. The governments tax, the governments regulate, and that's how public goods are provided. But internationally, globally, there's no global government. And therefore, public goods tend to be underproduced. And the problem is that there's an incentive for most countries to free ride. If you're a small country, let's take Switzerland, since we're in Switzerland, it doesn't make a lot of difference whether you pay a lot into a fund for global public goods or not. You're going to get about the same amount whether you pay or don't pay. If that's the case, then why not free ride? It's almost irrational to pay your dues if you're going to get the results without paying your dues. And that is the classic problem of global public goods. On the other hand, the largest country, for example, Britain in the 19th century, would produce global public goods like freedom of the seas, using the British Navy to police it, a relatively stable international monetary system, a relatively open international trading system, not out of the goodness of its heart or charity, but because it affected Britain. And Britain was so large and so important that if it didn't do these things, it would notice and it would suffer. So the largest country has an incentive to contribute to global public goods out of self-interest. And in that sense, Britain played that role. But the United States in the 1930s, though it had become the world's largest country or most powerful country, didn't play that role. For example, in 1928, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which essentially was called the beggar thy neighbor tariff. We tried to keep jobs at home by putting up tariffs, which meant others then raised their tariffs in retaliation. Tit for tat, it just drove international trade down. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt, a great liberal president, one of our truly great presidents, was invited by the British to come to London to an international monetary conference to see whether there could be an agreement on a system to stabilize international monetary affairs and get us out of the Great Depression. And Roosevelt said, no, I'm not coming. He was thinking about the problems he had at home, which are 1/4 of Americans were out of work. And he had to focus, in his view, on that domestic political question, not go trotting off to London and have somebody twist his arm that he should be cooperative on international monetary affairs. And of course, he wound up taking the US off gold. So that was the free riding attitude of the United States. And in the view of Charlie Kindleberger, that's what drove the system to lower depths than it otherwise would have. Business cycles are natural in market economies, but it didn't have to get as low as it did in the 1930s with the concomitant political effects that I mentioned. So that's the shape of the problem. And the question then is, we ask about the role of China and the rise of China, is whether China is going to fall into a Thucydides trap, creating fear which will lead to war, or is the greater problem that China will fall into a Kindleberger trap, acting like the US did in the 1930s and trying to be a free rider after it's gained sufficient size that it should be participating in the production of global public goods, or what former World Bank President Robert Zoellick called a responsible stakeholder. Now, I think that analysis, which of these two dimensions of the power transition, is important, and I'm afraid that much of the time that we spend is only on half of the analysis, only on Thucydides, and not enough on Kindleberger. So part of the question that we want to think about is how do we broaden our frame of reference as we talk about power transition theory? But the other part of the answer has to deal not with these changes at the level of the international system, but with changes in domestic politics. And there, the key question is whether the rise of populism and nationalism is going to undercut the ability of countries to cooperate. And if one looks at the recent editorial in the Wall Street Journal by H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, and Gary Cohn, the National Economic Advisor in the White House, two of the more reasonable people in the White House, their comment was that international politics is not among a community of nations. It's an arena for competition, or echoing Trump's view, it's something in which it's winner take all time after time after time, each on its own bottom. That's a problem because it means that the kind of reciprocity and long-run definition of self-interest that you need to maintain a rules-based system is difficult. So it's one thing for Trump in his inaugural address to say America first. I bet you can't find a political leader who says my country second. The key question is how do you define first? First alone or first with others? And first in the short term or first over a long horizon in what's good for me can be good for you as well. And I think the key problem that we have to focus on is whether the issue as framed by Trump and his advisors is going to make it difficult to create and sustain global public goods. Or if I can again telegraph my conclusion, I worry more about the rise of Trump than the rise of China. Let me then say a little bit about how we got where we are. There is a view, for example, expressed by Edward Luce, a columnist from the FT, Financial Times, that in his words, the 1945 system is over because the U.S. is in decline. So on that view, the U.S. becomes the largest economy in 1900. It becomes the most powerful country in 1917 when Woodrow Wilson sends 2 million Americans to fight in Europe. But then the Americans go home, and in the 1930s, we have what I call the Kindleberger trap. And in 1945, Harry Truman and his colleagues say, you know, that was a mistake. We can't do that again. So in 1947, when the British send a message to Washington saying, we can no longer defend Greece and Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean against Soviet aggression, Truman announces the Truman Doctrine, that the United States will step in. 1948, you have the Marshall Plan to help Europe recover. 1949, the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 1950, the U.S. sends troops to Korea under a UN banner to repel the North Korean aggression in crossing the 38th parallel. And that basically has created a structure of security which has lasted for 75 years. If you think about it, unlike World War I, where we brought the troops home, the troops are still there in those places. Not exactly the same troops, but you get the idea. Now, that's been important because a structure of security is essential for markets to work well. When there's great insecurity, markets don't work well. So that structure of the American alliance system, combined with the establishment of a set of rules, sometimes called the Bretton Woods rules, from 1944, but supplemented later by a variety of means, created an international order which was good for the US. It was also good for many countries, not good for everybody. The US sometimes made mistakes, did dumb things, but by and large, it was produced by a United States which was powerful. So if Edward Luce is correct that the 1945 system is over because the United States is in decline, then again, that's very important for us to be aware of and think about in answering this question. I wrote a little book a couple of years ago called Is the American Century Over?, which tried to establish some facts and figures to make the argument that the United States is not in decline. But one of the things you have to do is distinguish between two different senses of the word decline. There's absolute decline, which is what happened to ancient Rome. Absolute decline, Rome was unable to fend off barbarians. Remember, it didn't succumb to the rise of another empire, the Persians or the Gauls or whatever. It succumbed to hordes of barbarians, and it couldn't fend them off because it had no internal economic productivity, but instead was locked into internecine warfare. And so people sometimes say the US is like Rome. No, that doesn't fit. And if you think about it, let me just give you a couple of rough indicators. Despite all the problems of American politics today, in demographics, the US is the one rich developed country which is going to hold its position in demographic rankings. According to the UN demographers, today the ranking is China, India, US. 2050, it's going to be India, China, US. It's interesting there is the US stays where it is. Russia doesn't, Europe doesn't, Japan doesn't. It's hard to find any other developed country that stays in that kind of ranking. Most are suffering a relative demographic decline. A second indicator, which I would say is indicative of why the US is not in absolute decline, is to look at the technologies that are going to drive economic and military power in the 21st century. And most people would say that those are likely to be biotechnology, nanotechnology, and the next generation of information technology, particularly artificial intelligence and big data. And then if you ask, in what country is at the forefront of all three of these technologies, it's generally agreed it's the US. And if you say, can they sustain that? If you look at the rankings of universities by Shanghai Jiao Tong University, which ranks the top 20 universities in the world, they say that 15 of the top 20 are in the United States and none are in China. So that doesn't fit with this image of ancient Rome and an absolute decline. But notice that you can have a resistance to absolute decline and still have relative decline. And relative decline is what happened, for example, to the Netherlands in the 17th century. If you look at your Rembrandts, you'll see that the Dutch had a pretty good life. It wasn't as though they were impoverished or suffering like Rome, but the British were able to mobilize sea power and take away naval dominance from the Dutch. And in terms of being the dominant power in Northern Europe, the Dutch were in relative decline. So the question is, could the United States be in an analogous position in terms of relative decline? And then you say, okay, who would replace the US? One possibility is Europe. Europe has the capacity in terms of total size when it acts as a unit, in terms of human resources, in terms of technology. Europe is a potential contender. It lacks one thing, and that's unity. And the question of how much unity we're going to have, so How soon? I don't think it's going to be that soon. A second contender might be Russia. Russia still has a nuclear arsenal on the scale of that of the United States, and Russia has aspirations. But on the other hand, when you look at Russia, I think you could see that this is a country that is in decline. It's in demographic decline, as I already mentioned, and its economy is based on energy exports. 2/3 of its exports are oil and gas. And it's got such a corrupt system that it can't re-engineer its domestic economy to make it a more effective modern economy. So I don't see Russia as a contender. India is possible. I mentioned that India is likely to be the largest country in the world in terms of population. But India has a long way to go still. It's profiting from 7% plus rates of economic growth. But India's economy of $2 trillion, the US is an economy of $20 trillion. And if India is going to catch up, even if it's not just catching up with the US, it's got to use more of its human resources. 1/3 of Indian women are illiterate. That's a terrible waste of human resources, if nothing else. So I don't think India is a contender, and that brings us back to where we started, China. So the question then is China going to become the replacement for the US, either in the Thucydides version or the Kindleberger version? My view is that China is not about to pass the US. China is a $12 billion economy. The US, as I mentioned, $20 billion. Some people like to say, but if we use purchasing power parity, China's already bigger. The problem with that is you don't import jet engines or oil at purchasing power parity. You import it by exchange rates. But China is definitely doing well. It's done extremely well. I suspect it'll continue to grow despite a number of problems that have been identified. The Chinese sometimes talk about the problem of growing old before they grow rich. But the problem is not one where I think China is going to be quickly passing the US. China, as I said, may pass the US in total size sometime in the 2030s. In per capita income, it'll still be roughly a quarter of the US as it is now, and that's a measure of the sophistication of an economy. And in terms of military power, while China has been greatly increasing its military budget, it's still only 1/4 of the American military budget. And in terms of soft power, where China has been placing a great deal of emphasis on the power to attract rather than coerce and pay, China has problems. One is it can't fully unleash the talents of its civil society, and the other is it has a lot of territorial conflicts with neighbors, which make it look threatening. The net result of that is the Portland consultancy, which does a index of soft power that it calls the Soft Power 30, which it produces annually, ranks China about 28th on soft power, not about to pass the US. Now, why is that of some importance? It's importance because it means that we probably don't have to worry as much about the Thucydides trap as people think. When you go back to the example of Britain and Germany on the eve of World War I, it's worth remembering that Germany had already passed Britain by 1900. So Germany was not just on Britain's heels, it was overcoming. If the numbers that I gave you tonight, and which are at greater detail in this book, Is the American Century Over? If those numbers are correct, China's not just about to pass the US. If that's true, we have time to manage this relationship. We don't have to succumb to fear. And if you go back to the original proposition by Thucydides, remember it had two parts: the rise in the power of and the fear it created in. We don't have to succumb to that fear because it's not something which is about to lead to overcoming or overpassing. So that pushes us back into this question of, will China become a responsible stakeholder? Will we avoid the Kindleberger trap? And I'm going to submit to you that actually the prospects for that are reasonable. If you look at China, China has tried not to overthrow the liberal international order, but to benefit from it. John Eikenberry, the Princeton political scientist, has made this point. He said, unlike, let's say, Nazi Germany, which is a revisionist power, which wanted to overthrow the system, so to speak, to kick over the table, China wants a seat at the table and wants to win more at the table for China, naturally, doesn't want to destroy the table because it's actually doing pretty well at the table. So in that sense, Xi Jinping, when he addressed the World Economic Forum at Davos in January, said that China had a strong interest in preserving the open international trading system. Donald Trump may have pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. Xi Jinping has not. And if you go back to behavior of China before 2016, you'll notice that China has been able and willing to cooperate on global public goods. China and the US were at loggerheads in 2009 on climate issues. That led to the Copenhagen sessions of the UN climate group to fail, or not to succeed is a polite way to put it. If you look at Paris in 2015, Obama and Xi had reached an agreement on how they would approach this, which helped with excellent French management of the process in Paris, and with solid European support, which helped produce a success at Paris. So from 2009 to 2015, China and others went from being free riders to setting up a framework for producing global public goods in the climate area. Or to give you another example, also in 2015, the United States and China had been at loggerheads over rules for cyberspace, each accusing the other of unfair practices. And the United States said, all right, we're both going to spy on each other. Nations have always spied on each other. Having an agreement not to spy is not very useful. But we could get an agreement not to spy for commercial purposes. In other words, you don't steal the intellectual property of another country's company and give it to your own company, because that's unfair and unbalances the global trading system. The Chinese, very dubious about this, but they changed their position. And in 2015, September 2015, Obama and Xi reached an agreement that they would not use cyber espionage for commercial purposes, and they took that agreement to the group of 20 major economies and got a broad support for it. That, again, I would submit, is cooperation in producing a global public good. So the interesting question of whether it's possible, well, I don't want to leave you with that. There's also the possibility that China won't cooperate, and China's rejection of the Law of the Sea Tribunal settlement or judgment relating to the South China Sea is a case where China didn't cooperate in producing a global public good. So I don't want to say there are no problems with China. I'm just saying that the view that China is not going to participate in this system because it wasn't invented here and they're going to kick it all over, that's not quite right. And there are prospects that we can avoid the Kindleberger trap. So that's what brings me back to the question of Trump and the domestic politics. We're going to see more and more issues that are transnational issues. Climate is a good example, financial stability, rules for cyberspace, transnational terrorism, which no one country can deal with by itself, whether it's China, the US, or anybody. And that's going to require an approach in which we think of power not just over others, but power with others. In other words, if we're going to deal with climate, I just used that example, it's going to be joint work, not one coercing another. And many of those issues, like climate, financial stability, or the internet, can't be solved by military means. They have to be networks and soft power and cooperation. I've given you evidence of why I think China can be recruited to cooperate, though it's imperfect evidence. But I also have this evidence that I gave you earlier, is the question of whether the United States will continue to cooperate, based on some of the statements by the Trump administration. The Trump administration, when it announced its international affairs budget, called it a hard power budget. And basically, it cut funding for the State Department and the UN by about a third. And they found this a matter of some pride. But it's worth noticing that one of the people who dissented from this position was General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, who said, if you starve the State Department, you're going to have to buy me more ammunition. And he said, let's remember that the United States has the power of intimidation, but it also has the power of inspiration, and that is soft power. So, ironically, the general in charge of the Pentagon understands that better than the civilian in charge of the White House. What we don't know is how long the Trump administration will continue the attitudes it has now. Sometimes people look at the 2016 election and say, this is a wave of populism that is sweeping away the global international order. But it's important not to overinterpret the 2016 election. What we do know is that Trump was not elected by the majority of the American people. He was elected constitutionally, but by 46%. We also know that if you look at the 2016 election and the actions that Trump has taken, like the withdrawal from Paris, that they're actions which are basically to appeal to his hard core of populist support, which some estimates have said are about a quarter of the population. And he's gone for appealing to this base rather than broadening his base. And that's led others to say that maybe that means that he will not be a two-term president. And if that's the case, and you have situations where the majority of American opinion supports the Paris Accords, opinion polls by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations show that 65% of Americans want to continue to have an active international foreign policy. And if you realize that in terms of financial capacity, the United States spends about 4% of its gross domestic product on defense and foreign policy, and that's less than half of what it used to spend at the height of the Cold War. There is a capacity there, both in public opinion and economics, for the United States to continue this order that we've seen since 1945. But what we don't know is what will happen when you have a very idiosyncratic and unpredictable man in the presidency. And that's why I'm very reluctant to bet the mortgage of my house on this. If Trump turns out to be a one-term president, then I think my original bet that I placed in front of you, I think I'll have a chance to win, in the sense that much of the damage that'll be done will look, in the terms of Larry Summers' Financial Times article, from the perspective of 2030, will look as an aberration. This was an odd 4 years during a very different type of presidency because of a very different type of individual. On the other hand, if there's some event that changes public opinion in a dramatic way, for example, another 9/11 or some major terrorist event, and public opinion then basically rallies behind Trump, because in times of crisis, that's what happens. Public opinion tends to rally behind the president, and he turns out to be not a 4-year president, then I think the most likely outcome is not that China will take over the international order, but the result will be entropy, the inability to get work done, a gradual deterioration of the capacity to produce global public goods. So those are two pictures of the future. I've told you I don't know the answer. That's true. I've also told you that I'm willing to make a bet at a modest level that the answer to my question behind me is no. But all I can say is I hope what I've done for you this evening is giving you some intellectual apparatus to structure your own answers and your own bets. So thank you very much.
Professor Nye, thank you very, very much for a dense, rich, thought-provoking, and very clear lecture. You have started through the lens of power transition theory to look at what might be the story of the potential relative decline of the US, whether we might be seeing a trap a la Thucydides, or whether we might see another trap a la Charles Kindleberger. And we have now time for a conversation with the audience, and I will abuse my position to ask the first question. We are here in Geneva, as you know, very attached to multilateralism in the number of areas, including, of course, human rights and trade. And 2 weeks ago, we had here the US ambassador to the UN here in Geneva. And the question was, what next in terms of the US position and work, for instance, within the Human Rights Council? And my question is, do you think that even if we see a one-term Trump regime, do you think that the changes that we have been seeing in terms of investment in an open multilateral trading system and the investment of the US and leadership in the multilateral human rights system might go unaffected, or do you think that we are seeing a real change which will perdure even if we see a change after this first term?
Well, that's a very important question, and I think it may not be as dire as it first looks, because Trump has a very idiosyncratic style of leadership, which is to stake out outrageous positions or difficult positions, but then to move off them, and it doesn't bother him about being inconsistent. So, for example, in the campaign, he said he was going to declare China a currency manipulator on day one of his administration and slap 40% tariffs on China, which would have been pretty devastating for an organization just down the street here. He hasn't done that. Day one is long past. And he said in the campaign that NATO was obsolete, but 2 months into his presidency, NATO was no longer obsolete by his statement. He has said that he was going to move the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It hasn't happened yet. So there's a lot that we don't know about what will happen. He was going to tear up the Iran nuclear agreement. he hasn't torn it up yet. Doesn't mean he might not tear it up tomorrow. So I find it difficult to answer your question honestly, because frankly, none of us quite understand the strategy behind what Trump is doing. Usually with a political leader, you can see the strategy, and that gives you some sense of prediction. If you don't believe in institutions, and you don't make a strategy clear, and your style of leadership is by surprise and attack, and not being predictable, which is what his style is, growing out of his background in New York real estate and reality TV. It's very hard. No, but seriously, that's what the man's framework is. And if we're trying to understand policy, we have to think not how would I do it, but what is his mental framework. So I tend to think that on a lot of these things, he has backed away. And I don't think that the damage will be permanent if it's a 4-year presidency. After all, on Paris, our full withdrawal, whatever that means, doesn't occur until after the 2020 election. And in the meantime, many cities and states and non-governmental groups are taking the lead at home in terms of reducing carbon emissions and so forth. So I think the bark is worse than the bite, but again, I'm not going to bet too much on it.
Thank you very much. So we are moving to the audience, and we have a few people with microphone. We'll take a first question here, please. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Nye, for this rich debate. I would like to shift the debate a little bit towards multinational organizations and actually companies. How do you evaluate the role of companies in this power transition? Do you think they have been doing enough in terms of protecting the global good and preserving the welfare of the labor, most importantly? And would you expect in the next 5 years a global resistance movement similar to late 1960s, maybe with participation of some of us in this room?
Well,
maybe with yourself as well.
It's an interesting question. I don't think there's any one answer. Different companies behave in different ways. One of the things that has struck me is that on the issue of climate, most of the large energy companies have opposed Trump's decisions on this. And Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, who used to be the CEO of Exxon, actually has said that climate change is important, and he was opposed to withdrawing from Paris. But there is another aspect of this, which is beyond just companies. How, if we're really serious about keeping a rules-based international system, which requires multinational institutions and cooperation, we have to pay more attention than we've done in the past decade or two to those who are left behind and the problem of inequality. There is a proposition by John Ruggie, my colleague at Harvard, that the difference between 1945 and 1914 was not the degree of globalization, but the fact that the welfare state had come in. And he called this embedded liberalism. And that meant that even though it was still a market economy, it wasn't like 1914 where it was winner take all. And that embedded liberalism meant that you could have political stability while you had rapid globalization. Another of my colleagues, Danny Roderick, an economist, has said the problem that we've seen in the last decade or two is information technology greatly speeded up the development of global supply chains, which speeded up globalization, but it also undercut this embedded liberalism. So a lot of people who voted for Trump had been working in factories in Ohio or elsewhere, let's say the Middle West, and lost their jobs because their jobs went to China or to Mexico or whatever. And the American political system has something called trade adjustment assistance, but it doesn't work very well. And it means that if those of us who think it's important to maintain a liberal international system are serious, we have to think more about making sure that the benefits are better distributed. And we have to deal more seriously with the problems of inequality. I'm not sure that a 1960s style movement does this. Sometimes some of the actions in the 1960s were counterproductive. The actions produced reactions, which were not always in a positive direction, but sometimes in a negative direction. Students for a Democratic Society, for example, which wound up bombing academic buildings, including one in which I worked, did not generate a lot of support, just the opposite. So the 60s analogy worries me a little bit, but the larger point that you're making, which is that to maintain an open international system, if you go back to my analysis, you can't focus just on the great power politics and power transition. You have to focus on the domestic support, and that requires making sure that we don't lose this embedded liberalism and pay more attention to the equality problems which are necessary for support in a democracy.
Thank you. We have you, Madam. Yes.
Should I stand up? Okay. Thank you. Dr. Nye, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. My name is, Vera, and I'm a former Duke graduate, and I've just graduated here at, I've received my PhD here at the Graduate Institute. I'd like to focus on soft power, which is one of your, which you coined this word and this term, and I strongly believe in it. Having studied in the United States and having witnessed what it is to have soft power. However, I think that perhaps we're focusing today on Trump a lot, but I think that the United States lost its soft power long before. I think there's been a disillusionment in the liberal world order, and which the United States promotes. And I'd like to quote Confucius, as you quoted earlier Thucydides. Confucius said, "The object of the superior man is truth." And I think that the superior man or country lately has not been promoting the truth. And if I may say, a lot of disillusionment in terms of if we want to really keep this international world order, and where you're saying we're producing global public goods, I think that rather than public goods, a lot of wars have been created, and a lot of these have not been necessarily innocent wars. So I'd like for you to speak to that part of perhaps, do we want China to continue this kind of world order? And how can the United States help in changing this type of movements lately?
Well, it's a very important point you make, and I don't want my focus on Trump to seem as though it was a partisan issue or a criticism just of Trump. I was trying to be analytical rather than partisan on this. There have been various cycles in American soft power in the past when America has lost soft power. The most recent was after George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003. And you can look at the public opinion polls in Europe, Latin America, most of the world, and you'll see that in Western European opinion, for example, the United States lost about 30 points of attractiveness, according to most polls, because of Bush's invasion of Iraq. So there's a case where the use of hard power undercuts soft power. it also is counterproductive, which is that if you want to deal with terrorists, which Al-Qaeda was a terrorist, is still a terrorist organization, you need the help and support of sympathetic Muslims and others. And if you essentially misuse your hard power, as the US did, for example, at Abu Ghraib and so forth, or using torture, you alienate those people who you need as your allies. Soft power is never going to convert the hardcore, the people who flew the planes into the buildings on 9/11. You have to use hard power of policing and intelligence and so forth to catch the hardcore. But soft power is essential to deal with the surrounding environment in which these people operate. And if you alienate rather than attract the rest of the community, then you are undercutting your hard power. Bush didn't understand that, and he, I think, had a very bad effect on American soft power. But before I conclude that, I want to point out that a lot of what soft power of a country comes from its civil society, not its government. And remember that in the 1960s, the American war in Vietnam, to go back to your point about unjust wars, the American war in Vietnam was very unpopular. People were marching in the streets all over the world protesting the American government policy in Vietnam. But what's most interesting is that the song they were singing was not the Communist Internationale of Ho Chi Minh. It was Martin Luther King's "We Shall Overcome." So in other words, at the same time that the US government was wildly unpopular, the US civil society was able to generate ideas that were able to attract people. This relates to the comment that the woman made earlier about we don't want to think too narrowly just of government actions, but also where is civil society on this. And so I take your point. I think you're correct, but I think if you put it in that perspective, you can see that it. I think we're going to lose soft power under Trump, but I also think we can regain it again.
Thank you, Professor Nye. My name is Antonio Donini. I look at these issues from a humanitarian perspective, which is slightly different. And I'm wondering whether you would answer in the same way you answered if the question was slightly different. And the question was, are we seeing the end of the American rule-based order? Because there's an argument that many of the rules around which this order has been based since the end of the Second World War are now falling apart. You have many more wars where you have international humanitarian law free zones or human rights free zones. You have not only the attitude of the Trump administration, but Brexit and the sort of end of the European dream or the decline of the European dream. You have many other instances where multilateralism, which has gone through a period, it seems to have reached the end of an arc, and now other things are happening that are not multilateral. They're minilateral or they're bilateral. And so I wonder if what we're seeing is not so much the decline of the American economic and political and soft power, but a shift in the way in which the order, if there is one, is being conceptualized.
Well, that's very interesting, because as we look at the liberal international order, we assume that the economics, the global commons and values like human rights coincide, and they may not. They may vary differently. But I think, and so let's go back before Trump so that we can avoid the current problem, and ask whether there was a decline in multilateralism before that. I'm not sure. I mean, if you look at the two cases I mentioned, the climate accord, there was progress on multilateralism there. if you look at rules for the internet, which is something I've been trying to think about, what's interesting is that the majority of nations have agreed in the context of the UN group of government experts, which is all the major cyber-capable countries, that the laws of armed conflicts, which is you don't attack civilians, will apply in cyberspace. So it's not just that you don't bomb a Red Cross hospital, though there are always violations, but that's still a norm. There's an effort to spread this norm into cyberspace. And the UN GGE report is a preliminary and early phase, but it's interesting to me that that it has moved in the direction of trying to introduce multilateral cooperation into a very new and difficult area. So leave aside Donald Trump and just ask whether the trend you're describing was there before 2016. I'm not convinced. And I think there's some areas where we've fallen back, some areas where we've made progress, but I don't think we're really backing away from a rules-based international system.
Professor Andonova.
Thank you, Joe, for this fantastic reflection on the future of the liberal order. When I read the title, I thought, I hope not. And you made excellent analysis based more or less on great power politics and the supply of public goods and institutions. How about transnational politics, about which you wrote in the 1970s and onwards? I mean, at that time, the outlook of transnational politics was relatively positive. NGOs, epistemic communities, governance networks, and so on and so forth. Increasingly, however, transnational networks are a direct threat both to liberal ideas and to the liberal order and to security, including human trafficking, drug trafficking, cybercrime, terrorist networks. And to me, this is a significant threat to the liberal order. And how does this fit with your analysis?
Well, you are an expert on this, and so I would take your judgment on it, but I would say that transnational networks, some are good and some are bad, as you mentioned. Al-Qaeda is a transnational network. It's not a good network from my value point of view. But there are other transnational networks which have been very important. If you look at the transnational networks that support the analysis of climate science, that's been extremely important. If you look at the transnational networks that have sustained the ability to maintain a global domain name system for the internet, so that the internet doesn't fragment, that's largely transnational. There is the ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, but beneath the ICANN is the ISOC, the Internet Society, and beneath that is the International Engineering Task Force. And those are the people who actually work the protocols to make sure that cooperation continues. So those are two examples of very beneficial transnational networks on two very important issues, climate and cyber. But you're right, there are other transnational networks which are very threatening. And so I don't think we can say all one or all the other.
I will now give the floor to Dawei, but just briefly introduce him because he happened to be one Chinese student benefiting from the joint agreement between your alma mater and ours. Good. He just finished his first year here in this dual master degree program between the Graduate Institute and the Kennedy School, so he will go now, I think, this weekend to Boston and start in your institution.
Good.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, indeed, it's a very privileged to listen to your lecture even before my enrollment in Kennedy School. And thank you very much. I come from China, and I do have a question about China. it is still about your point of soft power. You mentioned during the lecture that Chinese performance in terms of soft power is not so good and ranked 28 in the world. So my question that if Chinese President Xi Jinping seek your advice, he asked Professor Nai, could you give me some advice how China should build the soft power to improve the ranking of China in terms of the soft power? So what kind of advice you will give him? Thank you.
So you have a new job.
Actually, I've had an opportunity to answer that question that was put to me by high-ranking Chinese officials. So I'll give you the same answer I gave them, which is China using soft power is a very smart strategy, because as China's hard power increases, it's likely to frighten its neighbors. And if you can at the same time increase your soft power so that you become more attractive, they're less likely to form coalitions against you. So when Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress in 2007 that China had to invest more in its soft power, that was a very smart decision. And Xi Jinping has kept that policy, and China's been spending a good deal of money on this. With that said, there are two things that limit Chinese soft power, which I referred to very quickly in my comments. One is, if it's true, as I argued earlier about the United States, but I think it's true for China as well, that a great deal of soft power comes from civil society, not just from government policies, then the extent to which the Communist Party insists on controlling civil society in great detail undercuts a great source of Chinese soft power. A good example of this would be Ai Weiwei. Brilliant, a creative individual, but not properly treated by the Chinese government. If China should be developing and encouraging many Ai Weiweis, even if it makes it a little difficult for party control. So that's one thing, which is relax and allow civil society more leeway. The other is China has, and this affects Chinese soft power primarily in relationship to its neighbors, not in Africa or Latin America, for example. China has territorial disputes with Japan, with Vietnam, and with India, among others. And to the extent to which China pushes those territorial disputes, it creates fear in those countries. So sometimes people say the United States is trying to contain China, but that's not true. If you look at containment in the Cold War, we had almost no trade and no student relations with the Soviet Union. We have a lot of trade, including a deficit, and 300,000 Chinese students in the US today. I think that's a good thing, but that's not containment. That's a policy of engagement. But I argue that what China does is practice self-containment. The more you threaten the Philippines and Vietnam, such as putting an oil drilling rig off an island that the Vietnamese think is theirs in the Paracels, the more you drive them into our arms. So it's not that the Americans are out trying to contain, it's that the Chinese, by frightening their neighbors, drive them into relying on the Americans. So the secret for China is at the civil society side, relax. And on the relationships of conflict with your neighbors, create codes of conduct, go a little lighter on how hard you push these territorial disputes. You're going to be the largest power in East Asia. You don't have to push so hard on every small advantage. So take a, essentially, I guess what I'm saying is relax and you'll do well. Sure.
So, Professor, I accept to take one more question, please.
Thank you. If you allow, can I raise two questions briefly? Thank you so much, Professor Nai, for your fascinating lecture. My name is Xian Hong. I'm a Chinese binational, but I assume myself as a global citizen. As chairman just mentioned, here's Geneva. It's a capital of multilateral agencies, a UN system, which is a system established since 1945 as well. And since now there remains such uncertainty regarding the liberal order at the global level, would you think it's a good idea to strengthen UN agencies to take a lead to shape the global liberal order? They are here, they are empowering soft power of all the countries. So then I will see that as an opportunity for the future. And my second small question about, I appreciate your insights on the information technology. You have mentioned several issues, including the artificial intelligence, including the big data, Internet of Things. My question is, this powerful technology are slightly different from what we had before. It seems like such a revolution which is going to change everything. They're going to change the global order. They're going to change international relations. They're also going to change the concept of peace and war. So what do you think about this impact of the technology on the international relation? Particularly, do you think the cyber war is already a reality? And cyber peace should be another important subject for us to look at. Thank you.
Well, those are both very good questions. Let me take them in reverse order. I think that we can imagine avoiding major cyber conflicts. I've just published an article in the journal International Security called Deterrence and Dissuasion in Cyberspace. And it asks the question of, can you create deterrence of conflict in cyberspace? And the argument is yes, but it's going to not look like nuclear deterrence in the Cold War. It's going to have several mechanisms. One is the threat of punishment. The other is what's called deterrence by denial, by raising the barriers to attack. The third is engagement, which is a mutual interdependence. And the fourth is development of norms, such as I referred to earlier. So if you want to follow this, look at the last issue of International Security, and you see my view of how, despite these radical changes in technology that cyber represents, that there still are ways that we can manage to avoid destructive conflict. On your first point, which is a good point to end on, I think, given the importance of Geneva and the Institute and multilateral institutions, I have a long-standing commitment to multilateral institutions, and including the UN system. But I think we have to be realistic that unless the large powers cooperate within those institutions, the institutions can't do it by themselves. And I think if you look at the example I gave about climate, is if you try to get 189 or 193 countries to sit around the table, and as you know the UN process, it's very hard to get much done. If, on the other hand, you get the countries, the major problem causers, in this case China and the US, to reach agreement and then to work with others to prepare the ground, then the role of the UN of opening this up for others to participate and then legitimizing the results is crucial. And that's the case of the change between Copenhagen in 2009 and Paris in 2015. You know, if you look at carbon dioxide is the one area where China is the world superpower. It's past the United States. But to be realistic about it, China and the US are the biggest problems. Unless China and the US work together and cooperate, and then also with India and others. But unless we work together, the idea that you can do it just by votes of 189 or 193 countries, or it's not going to work. So a proper assessment of multilateralism is that it's a way to get large powers to look at their long-run interest, because as Robert Axelrod, as the professor at the University of Michigan once put it on the evolution of cooperation, you can avoid zero-sum games and tit-for-tat reductions to the lowest denominator that you have in the so-called prisoner's dilemma game if there is a long shadow of the future. A long shadow of the future means you may win this round, I may win the next round, who knows, but we're going to be playing this game together for a long, long time, and the best strategy for us to do is to cooperate. And what multilateral institutions do is, in addition to providing rules, they provide the institutional framework that creates the long shadow of the future. And that's why I worry so much about Trump's narrowness. It's not America first that bothers me. It's America first and only, and it's looking at American national interest in the short term rather than the long term. So think of multinational and multilateral institutions as crucial to creating Axelrod's long shadow of the future.
Well, Professor Nye, I think the applause is bear witness to our deep appreciation of the food for thought that you have given us this evening. This conversation now is drawing to a close. I realize that I neglected a bit the left wing of the auditorium, but be reassured that this was not politically laden. Sorry for this, but I wish really to convey on behalf of all the participants this evening our sincere gratitude for your lecture and for participating in the discussion. And I want to let you know that since you came here for a year, by the end of the 1960s, you are welcome anytime to come back as an invited professor at the Graduate Institute. And thank you very much.